So yeah, I wrote this book. It's about adolescent development. What I say to parents is you should probably get it by about age 10, is sort of when it picks up. I'm going to come back to that. It is about adolescent girls. I am laying out a developmental model that I actually won't talk about today, though elements of the book will come all through this talk. It is a developmental model that applies to boys as well as it applies to girls. And I've had several parents who have sons and daughters who read the book who said, 90% of it was also true for my son. And I think that is true. So if this is something you're thinking, like, what about a book for boys, which I get asked about a lot, I'm like, just buy my old book. You know, I'm not going to write a new book because I only have 10% more to say about boys and I don't know them as well as I know girls. So what I'm going to talk about today is early adolescence, understanding and guiding young teenagers. And I know that many of you, I got wonderful numbers as sort of the ages, you know, you've got 4th through 8th grade children, you've also probably got younger children and older children. The first thing I want to say, and this gets to what I said about, you might as well, you know, if you're going to get my book, age 10 is a good place to start. There is a misunderstanding about when adolescence begins. And I think it's because of the terminology teenager. I think people feel like you're good till 13. Like you have a child, and then at 13 you have a teenager. And I was reading, and you know, we came up with this term tween, right, to kind of capture something a little bit before teenager. But to me, that's always felt like a little bit of a cheat, you know, like, no, they're still kids, they're still kids. But about 6 months ago, I was reading a large meta-analysis of studies on teenagers. And in this very, very dry academic paper, there was a very dry line that really caught my attention. And they said, we use the standard definition of adolescence, ages 11 through 19. And I thought, that's right, actually, that is what psychologists believe. We do believe that, and we've always believed that. And when we have parsed development, what we have tended to talk about is there's 0 to 5, which is crazy, right? And then, we don't call it that, but you know what I mean, right? There's 0 to 5. And then the period from 6 to 11, we call it latency, which is things calm down. Everything gets a little mellower. And it really is fun. I mean, this is a really fun age to parent, right? Your 6-year-old likes you, they want to go to the grocery store with you, your 10-year-old wants to play cards. I mean, this is a really fun developmental phase. Latency ends by 11, meaning things kick up by 11. And this has been in my training. I got trained more than 20 years ago. I've known this all along. And so I thought, parents should know that, right? That we have long believed, even before anybody coined the term tween, we have long believed that latency ends at 11 and things start to get weird after 11. And the reason it feels to me so critical to communicate that, there's two things. One is, you're not too early to be at this talk, right? You're probably here for a reason, and even if it hasn't started to get weird in your house, it will really soon. The other is, it's so amazing to me how often parents say, oh my God, it's already happening. She's only 11 and she's acting like a teenager, right? And they, excuse me, they feel like, oh, this was off the rails. Like, I thought I had 2 more years. Like, what's wrong with my kid? And so I do feel like, I mean, I don't know how I could squeeze a whole column out of this, but I do feel like I should write a column that is like, adolescence begins at 11, right? Like, just, I think everybody should know that, and they would feel so much less anxious when their 11-year-old starts acting like a teenager. Even though it feels premature, it's really, really not. So that is a long opener to say, if you're not there, you're about to be there. If you've got an 11-year-old, you're already in it. And my aim today is to give you, I'm going to call it my parade of metaphors, right? To get you through what is coming or what you may already be in. Okay, so the first thing I want to say about my parade of metaphors is that the way I think and the way I was trained rests on a very critical assumption that is not actually in the culture right now, which is that normal behavior, I have one I do somehow. Thanks. That normal development is extraordinarily challenging. And we've come in the culture to a place that I don't feel good about in terms of parent guidance or parent advice, which is, I think the overriding tenor of that advice is, okay, this should be super fun, you should be having a good time with your kid, they should do what you ask, mostly this should be delightful, you should get along and look forward to being with them a lot, And if that's not happening, someone's messing this up. Right? That seems to me the overriding tenor of parent advice. Okay, so I'm not quite this cynical, but if I had to do my version of that, it would be like, okay, this is super hard, my house is a mess, most times I don't know what I'm doing or why they're acting like that. Occasionally it is surpassingly delightful. There are moments where you're like, oh, I get it, right? Or my 6-year-old and 13-year-old want to put on a dance performance for me that they spent an hour in the basement working on. I'm like, okay, this I'll do, right? This is great. And the rest of the time, like, I'm mostly just tired, right? That's parenting, and that's typical parenting. And I feel like the overriding view right now that this is supposed to be great and you're supposed to know what to do and your kid's supposed to do what you ask, I think leaves a lot of parents feeling like they don't feel good about what's happening at home and they don't feel like they can talk about what's happening at home. So this is a talk of parade of metaphor and parade of how hard this is in all of the most typical and normal and expectable ways. So the way I'm going to divide this is into 3 categories of your emerging adolescent's relationship with things. So first is your emerging adolescent's relationship with his or her feelings and emotions. Next is his or her relationship with you, the parent. And then the third, and I saved this to the end, and we won't spend a ton of time on it, but it's going to come around faster than any of us want, which is their relationship with risky behavior. Right? That's what's scary about having a teenager. Fundamentally is that our awareness that all of a sudden they are exposed to and fascinated by a whole lot of risky stuff. And they feel less and less in our control because they are. So I'm going to walk us through those 3 domains. So starting with teenagers and their emotions. Okay, so you may have noticed that your teenager's feelings are really out of control. And this really does start often by 11 or 12 and really starts to crest at 13, especially in girls. Some of it's driven by hormones, and I'll come back to that. And what we see is there's a very intense period of emotionality that is part of early adolescence. It sort of hits its height at 13 and 14. And the good news, I'll jump to the good news, things actually smooth out later in adolescence. 15, 16, 17, much less emotional. I run a research center at the school where I consult, and we have children from ages 2 to 18. And I've sometimes joked, like, we could do a study on tissue box consumption, right? And we could, in terms of like measuring emotionality across the classes, right? And so like we'd use the metaphor for this that you will see with both male and female teenagers is that it is if the teenager is a swimmer and the water is the world, and you are the pool that is holding the whole thing together. And teenagers, like swimmers, want to be in the water, right? They want to be out. They want to be splashing around. They want to be gaining strength. And they want to be with their friends. That's where all their friends are. They're out in the water. And like swimmers, they become tired, or somebody dunks them, or something goes wrong. And this is when they come scrambling for the wall to hold on and catch their breath. Okay, so in your homes, what this looks like, or what this will look like, is that your teenager who has not acknowledged you for 3 days, right, is suddenly upset, talking to you, and often there is a physical component, draping themselves on you, leaning into you, crawling in bed with you, and telling you stuff and asking for your advice. Okay, so then there's a parallel process that starts to emerge in this moment. You are so psyched, right? Like, this kid who has not let you touch him or acknowledge him in public is suddenly cuddling in bed with you asking for guidance. You are so like, yay, we're reunited. Okay, good for you. The parallel process going on for your teenager is, oh my gosh, I feel better now. My emotions are regulated again. Oh my gosh, I'm like a baby in water wings at the pool. This is humiliating, right? So they have to get away. And they push off. And these are often interactions that end extremely abruptly when the teenager sort of reconstitutes and this suddenly feels very, very regressive to them. So they'll say things like, wait, no offense, but like your breath is weird, right? And then they're gone, and then they're gone. And so you go from this moment of like, yay, you love me, this is fabulous, to like, ouch, and that is a typical swimming pool interaction. You are allowed to say, whoa, that was rude, right? You don't just have to take it. But what I will say is, you can't prevent these interactions, and you actually don't want to. This is a really important part of development, to have you there, to be able to reconstitute, and then to go away again, and know that you're there if they're needed, if they need you. This does happen equally between boys and girls. One of the weird things about my life is I now get emails from people telling me stories, and I got this lovely email. I articulate this metaphor in my book, and I got this lovely email from a mom. She said, "I just want you to know the swimming pool stuff totally happens with boys." And what she described is that her 17-year-old son made a practice of every once in a while coming into the TV room where she and her husband watch television and laying his head in her lap and asking her to rub his back. So like you can imagine as a mom, right? Like this is like heaven. Like this is one of those like surpassing moments, right, of parenthood. And then she said, and then he would stand up abruptly and leave the room without a word. Right? And she was always like, what happened? Like what did I do? You know? And she said, after I read your book, she said, now when he comes in, I rub his back and I look over at his dad and I go, and the beauty of this, and the reason I sort of stuck with this belabored metaphor is she knows what's coming. Right? She's not shocked and hurt when he stands up and goes. She knows he got his breath back. Now this feels super weird to have my mom rubbing her back. I gotta go. Right? So when I offer this metaphor, this is my way of saying, see it for what it is. When your kid comes into the wall and you miss them and you're so excited to be connected in that way again, like just look at your watch, right? It's not gonna last. When they push off, it's easier to take when you anticipated. Don't let them be rude. But this is typical development, and this is a very important purpose you serve in managing all of those big feelings. And I think that for me is the point of the neurological and biological stuff is the feelings really freak the kids out. They really are overwhelmed by their own emotions. And they recruit us to try to help them manage them, but often we don't know that's what's happening. All we know is suddenly, okay, Q is in my lap and now they're gone, right? And it's helpful if we can have a broader context for what's happening. So they'll say things like, wait, no offense, but like your breath is weird, right? And then they're gone, and then they're gone. And so you go from this moment of like, yay, you love me, this is fabulous, to like, ouch, you know, and that is a typical swimming pool interaction. You are allowed to say, whoa, that was rude, right? You don't just have to take it. But what I will say is, you can't prevent these interactions and you actually don't want to. This is a really important part of development, to have you there, to be able to reconstitute and then to go away again and know that you're there if they're needed, if they need you. This does happen equally between boys and girls. One of the weird things about my life is I now get emails from people telling me stories, and I got this lovely email. I articulate this metaphor in my book, and I got permission. And laying his head in her lap and asking her to rub his back. So like you can imagine as a mom, right? Like this is like heaven. Like this is one of those like surpassing moments, right, of parenthood. And then she said, and then he would stand up abruptly and leave the room without a word, right? And she was always like, what happened? Like what did I do? You know? And she said, after I read your book, she said, now when he comes in, I rub his back and I look over at his dad and I go, and the beauty of this, and the reason I sort of stuck with this belabored metaphor is she knows what's coming. Right? She's not shocked and hurt when he stands up and goes. She knows he got his breath back. Now this feels super weird to have my mom rubbing my back. I gotta go. Right? So when I offer this metaphor, this is my way of saying, see it for what it is. When your kid comes into the wall and you miss them and you're so excited to be connected in that way again, like just look at your watch, right? It's not gonna last. When they push off, it's easier to take when you anticipated. Don't let them be rude. But this is typical development, and this is a very important purpose you serve in managing all of those big feelings. And I think that for me is the point of the neurological and biological stuff is the feelings really freak the kids out. They really are overwhelmed by their own emotions. And they recruit us to try to help them manage them. But often we don't know that's what's happening. All we know is suddenly, okay, Q is in my lap and now they're gone. Right? And it's helpful if we can have a broader context for what's happening. Okay, sometimes you're a trash can. All right. So, back to school. This thing about the end of the day in school. Certainly by middle school, it is very common that mostly kids just complain unbelievably about school. And this is at fabulous schools. This is at the best schools. This is at amazing schools. And I get to work for an amazing school. My kids go to great schools. Your kids go to great schools. This is not anything about the school. it does help if we take a minute to step back and think about what school is, okay? Especially as kids get into more traditional education and, middle and high school. So this is what school is. School is, if I grab, say, 20 random members of our audience here, and I put you in a room, and I say, okay, you're gonna have a 15-minute meeting in that room. You don't get to choose the topic of the meeting. You don't get to choose the person running the meeting, and you don't have any say about how they run it. Okay, you're gonna do that for 50 minutes. Okay, now, I'm gonna take you guys, I'm putting you in another room, another meeting. You're not choosing the topic. Somebody else is running it. You have no say how it's run. Okay, we're gonna go do that a third time in another room. We're gonna do it a fourth time. Another room, another person running it. Okay, you get lunch. All right, we're gonna do 3 more meetings. Just like that, okay? Now, you come back tomorrow, we're gonna do all those exact same meetings again, okay? And we're gonna do that for 9 months straight, okay? That's school, right? It is helpful. It is helpful to sort of put it in that grown-up context, okay? In that context, kids are amazing. They are so good. They are so patient, they kind of go along with the program, they put up with the kid next to them who's driving them crazy, they do what they're asked, right? I mean, they're really good. They're really, really good. And I think that part of what happens is that over the course of the day, they collect a lot of what I would call emotional trash, right? Like, that kid is driving me nuts, I held it together, sticking that trash in my pocket, right? Can't stand that, meeting runner, I don't like the way they do the meeting, I hate the topic of the meeting, I'm holding it together, but that trash is in my pocket, okay? So then they walk in the door and we're like, how was school? Right? And they're like, you want to know? All the trash comes out, right? And they just start throwing at us, right? Like, then this happened, and this dumb thing happened, or whatever. And then we're thinking, what am I paying for you to be tortured all day at this, or whatever. I mean, our high taxes in Shaker Heights where I live for you to have this kind of torture. And then, like Gabrielle said, then we try to help. Then we're like, oh, well, did you tell the teacher you didn't understand the group project? And things like that. And then invariably the response is, no, you don't understand. You don't understand. Okay, so not to fall back on traditional gender tropes, but in this interaction, your kid is the wife who just wants to tell you what happened, and you are the husband who's offering useful solutions, right? Which is always the worst interaction, okay? So this is why I'm saying, just let them vent. Let them just dump the trash, right? They've collected the trash all day. They don't want to discuss the trash. They don't want your advice about how not to pick up that trash tomorrow, right? They just want to get rid of it. This system largely works. This is a really smart system. And in fact, if you think about it, what else would we want them to do, right? Besides being wonderful citizens all day long, manage it, contain it, come home, unload, go back with empty pockets, right? It's a really good system. You may, at times, feel the need to intervene. And I'm not saying never intervene. Couple things to think about. One is, ask your kid first. And if you're dying, if they're just complaining and complaining and complaining, and you're thinking, okay, this sounds bad, you can say, do you want my help, or do you just need to vent? And you will be amazed at how often they're just just let me just drop it here. That is a massive service you have provided. There may be times where you feel like you need to make a call to the school or to another family. I'm not saying that is never a good idea. Move with caution. Because the way I want you guys to think about it is kids feel about their trash the way we feel about our actual trash, which is once we have thrown it away, we don't want to see it again. So it may be that if you sort of spontaneously pick up the phone and make a call to the school about something your child dumped at home, and they come in and a well-meaning teacher says, yeah, I got a call from your dad, it sounds like you were worried about, you can be like, why is my trash back in school? Right? I left that at home, I'm over it. So I'm not saying it's not a good idea ever, but it's amazing how often the mere dumping of the trash does the job. And this is gonna bum you out, but it's gonna be okay. In a lot of parenting a teenager, if you feel terrible and they feel better, it has totally worked. You have served the proper function. This is one of those scenarios often. Okay. All right, when should you worry? Right? Okay, so if you're getting dumped on, if your kid's a swimmer, when should you worry? Normal adolescence is the roller coaster, up, down, up, down, up, down. We worry when it's not a roller coaster. We worry when a kid stays low day after day after day. We're so anxious that they can't function day after day after day. And a lovely metaphor that we do have in psychology is the idea that healthy people get sick and healthy people recover. They get colds and they get better. And the difference between health and illness is if you get sick and you can't get better. So I think, when you have a kid who is sobbing on the floor because of some group project, you need to look at that kid and say, let's see if they are better by dinner or tomorrow. And if they're not better tomorrow, and if they're not better the day after, then I'm going to step in. But I'm going to see if she can recover from this cold on her own because she is a healthy kid. And it's scary. I will tell you, I'm now confronting this as a parent. Like, it's scary to see, you're like, she's, and it's hard to not jump in. But I would say, give yourself a 24-hour rule. Most emotional maladies do sort themselves out in that time, and you'll be glad not to have strongly reacted. I think this is a great time to think about what helps your child pull him or herself back together. It's very individual to kids. I will definitely say in my home, I've been like, do you want to go take a shower? Somehow for my kid, that's a powerful thing. And I get a very different kid after that. So I think, thinking about some of the coping they like, I was thinking this morning, I do think I'm going to write a column called Why Teenagers Read Captain Underpants. Because a lot of teenage boys read Captain Underpants and a lot of teenage girls watch Lion King. There's often a kind of reconstituting themselves by going back to things they liked when they were little. So, we have our own ideas about what coping looks like, and sometimes I think we try to thrust them on kids, but kids actually have their own ways of coping too. So I would be attuned to those. But we only worry when there's a long stretch where it doesn't feel like the cold's going away. That's when I think it's important to step in. But it's hard. You have to be a very durable person as a parent of a teenager. Okay, teenagers and their parents, relationship with you. Okay, so let me start with eye rolling. This is a common function of adolescence. I kind of love it, and I'll tell you why. So, it is true that teenagers roll their eyes at adults as a sign of disrespect. That is true. I think that happens far less than we think it does in terms of what's driving the eye rolling. I think we receive eye rolling as a rudeness. I think it is maybe 20% of the time. That is the communication. So here's where I think eye rolling serves this fairly phenomenal function in adolescence. It lets teenagers do a lot of things that teenagers need to do. So the first thing about teenagers is they don't like being told what to do. You may have noticed this. And I tell this story, and it's a version of a true story. All the stories in my book, I morphed them very heavily because a lot of them came from my practice. But I tell this story of an adolescent I had in my practice, and I saw her on Friday afternoons. And she was a really organized and put together kid, and she came in uncharacteristically in a very bad mood. And I said, what's going on? And she said, okay, so you know how I do all my work at the dining room table? She was a junior in high school. I said, yeah. She said, okay, so my work has been all over the dining room table all week. I've had this horrible week of school. I got through it. I'm done with it. And I had an hour before our appointment, and I was going to go to the dining room table, and I was going to throw things away, and I was going to put things in folders. I was going to get it all into my backpack, and I was going to put it in my room for the weekend. I'd been looking forward to this all week and hadn't been able to get to it. She said, so I walked in my house, and my mom said, you have to get your stuff off of the dining room table. So instead of doing that, I had an hour-long fight with my mom about how I wouldn't do that. and the kid's cracking up as she's telling me this. She's like, and now I'm so pissed because my stuff is still all over the table. So I just thought, it was such a gorgeous, I can tell you, moments in my professional life where something came searing into focus. And that was one where you can have a teenager on their way to doing the thing you have asked. And then if you asked, well, now I can't do it. Okay. So the other thing they do is they do it, but they roll their eyes the whole time, right? Which is okay, I'm doing it, but not because you're making me, or I'm pissed, right? This is a fairly gorgeous solution, right? They're doing the thing they intended to do. They're doing the thing we've asked them to do. And they're sort of they're broadcasting, I'm not totally on board with this, right? That's a pretty good solution. The flip of it is we also ask them to do things they don't want to do, right? That's also part of being a parent. So they may be like, I'm cut it out, and you're like, not until you empty that dishwasher, right? Okay, so now the teenager has a choice. Do they have a fight with you about the dishwasher? Or do they roll their eyes the whole time they unload it? Okay, not a bad outcome for them to walk over to the dishwasher, unload the whole thing, rolling their eyes the entire time, and then walk out and go on their way. It's not lovely, but I also am thinking, okay, well, let's consider the alternative, which is you have a kid who really does not want to unload the dishwasher. You say, go unload the dishwasher. They unload the dishwasher, and they do not feel they can in any way or broadcast their disagreement about this. What we are essentially asking is, I want you to unload the dishwasher, and I want you to pretend like you like it, right? I'm not really sure we need that last piece. I think if they're rolling their eyes the whole time, you might say, you know that eye rolling only happens in the house, right? Because that's our concern, like that they would take it to school or they would take it to their first job or things like that. But I'm open to the idea that this is a pretty great way to be a defiant teenager, right? You're doing exactly what the grown-up asked while also exercising some sense of, I'm not doing it because you asked me to, or I'm doing it unhappily. The third thing has to do with the swimming pool. Sometimes teenagers roll their eyes to deflect. So if you have a teenager who is feeling fragile and on the verge of tears about something, and you say, hey, maybe they're on the tears about a friendship, and you say, Julia, she hasn't come over for a while lately, and your daughter goes, right? It may be that your kid's in a lot of pain about Julia, and having that conversation is going to make your kid dissolve in tears, and she doesn't want to do that. She doesn't want to have a regressive swimming pool moment right now, so she's going to roll her eyes just to make the whole thing go away. So I'm giving you no advice, and I'm not telling you how to handle eye rolling. But what I am interested in is how often it comes up, I think, in these very powerful negotiations that are going on between teenagers and parents around authority and privacy and space and distance and compliance and defiance. And it's just, I think it's a fascinating thing. I saw some of the questions that came up, and there was a question about, well, what to do about eye rolling. I would say if your kid's compliant, I would ignore a lot of it. I think there's a lot you can let go by. Another way to think about it, did you guys see that gorgeous essay, I'm sure some of you saw it, by Ruth Bader Ginsburg about the advice that her father-in-law gave her upon marrying her husband? Her father-in-law said to her, in every relationship, it sometimes helps to be a little bit deaf. Right? Just to, so stuff gets said that if you don't respond to it, it just sort of magically evaporates, and the better for everybody. So one of the things I do when I'm with schools is I'll often ask the teenagers, like, what do you want me to tell your parents tonight? And somehow in the course of the day with some teenagers, I had mentioned this essay. And several students, in their notes to me about what they wanted me to tell their parents, could you tell my parents that sometimes I wish they were a little bit deaf? And I thought, that's fair. Because teenagers are emotional, and they are reactive. And sometimes they roll their eyes, and then the second they've done it, they're like, ooh, damn, I didn't mean to do that. If we ignore it, carry on, a lot can get sorted out. Okay, other things to know. Oops, go backwards. Sometimes you're a landlord. Okay, back to our metaphors. So one of the things you will notice is that by 11 or 12, a lot of kids start to close their bedroom doors and hang out in their rooms at great length, doing the exact same thing they used to do with the door wide open. Right? And this is a very weird thing in a home. And it's weird too, and I've certainly been in this position, where you go, like you knock on the door, and then there's this like super long pause, right? And then they're like, yeah. And then you're like, can I come in? And then there's another super long pause. And they're like, okay. And I had been on the other side of the door thinking like, what are you doing? What could you possibly be doing in there that this is such an imposition? So here's what I think they're doing. I think that somewhere around 11 or 12, there is this realization that they will be moving out. That their time at home, they're more than halfway through it. And if you think about it, that's a pretty terrifying realization to come to. And so I think, and this is all I think an unconscious process, I think that what teenagers do is they think, well, let's do this. Why don't we pretend that my room is like my apartment, okay? And you're the landlord who drives me places and feeds me. but mostly I live here. So when we knock on their door, they're like, what is it? Like, why is somebody knocking, right? And they practice that for 6 to 7 years, and then they move out legitimately, right? And I think if you think about it in those terms, like, this is a brilliant solution, right? Like, I'm moving out psychologically, eventually I will move out physically, right? So that's a very common thing. The other thing that I think is very important to remember, a lot of kids will come home from school and go in their room and close the door. Those tend to be kids who are more on the introverted side of things, and where being at school all day, surrounded by humans, is very, very tiring for them. And I think there are a lot of kids who hold it together gorgeously all day and come home, and what they need is to not be near anybody else for a while, and we fall into the category of somebody else. And so I think if you have a kid who needs to go reconstitute a while and then come down for dinner, usually there's nothing wrong with that and there's no problem at all. They just needed to be alone a while. Okay, sometimes you're a potted plant. So this was a column I wrote in December. And the bottom line on this is that teenagers actually very much want their parents around, but they don't necessarily want to interact with their parents. And I think it's helpful to appreciate that. And the way I got to the thinking behind this metaphor is that, so I spend 2 days a week at a girls' school in Shaker Heights, Ohio, and I have this like little office where the girls can find me. And much to my surprise, over the years, on probably 3 or 4 occasions, really, really high-functioning, incredibly mature and independent girls have come to find me with the complaint that their parents are not home enough. And there's often a reason. They can have like a sibling in crisis, or the parents can have big jobs, or the girls seem so darn independent, the parents are like, let's go out, you know? I know full well, usually, that if the parents were home, this is a girl who would walk right by them and hardly acknowledge them. But when they're not home, she notices and she's complaining to me. I don't think she says anything to them. So the thrust of this is that there is real value in just being available without an agenda. And if we think about it, especially as kids move into adolescence, most adults are bringing an agenda. It's a teacher, it's a coach, it's a, some other grown-up who has some plan for that kid. There's enormous value in teenagers and adults having relationships, and I love the ones where it can be on the teenager's terms. That almost never happens. And so as your teenager moves, further into adolescence, do not underestimate the value of just being around, even if they seem to ignore you. And the way we think about this theoretically, the closest thing we have in psychological theory is the idea of a secure base that is used for attachment purposes. So when we look at little kids who are working out attachment with their parents, securely attached 3-year-olds will track their parents' movements through the home while they continue with what they are doing. And I think securely attached 17-year-olds do the same thing. They can be out in the world, moving out, getting distance, if they know where you are and where they can find you. So this is to say, lower your expectations about what a quality interaction is with an older teenager. It may not be this heart-to-heart conversation. It may be that you're in the kitchen doing your thing, and they know you're there, and they're up in their room doing their thing. That is a value in and of its own. And I think we don't credit parents enough for that. Okay, when to worry. I would say I worry about teenagers who are what I call full-time porcupines. It is very common for teenagers to be prickly with their parents. It is sometimes common for teenagers to be prickly with teachers. It is very unusual for a teenager to be prickly with every adult they know. That is not a common scenario at all. It is, I can tell you in diagnostic terms, clinicians would say that's probably adolescent depression until otherwise ruled out. That depression in teenagers looks like porcupine, and it looks like porcupine all the time. So as your teenager moves into a phase where you feel like they're pretty prickly, I think then the assessment is when to worry. Okay, but are you still hearing from the neighbors that your kid is like the nicest kid they've ever met? All is well, right? Are you going to school conferences and you do not recognize the child you're describing? All is well, right? So that is normal development. But if your kid's being prickly with you and then you get to school and it's clear that your kid's being prickly with everybody, that's a concern. I hate to say it. I mean, this is like, I could also do like the parade of bad news. Like, if you feel terrible, this is going great. And another is, if you are hearing from people, oh my gosh, your daughter comes over and she's a conversational delight, my kids love her and she's the best. And you're thinking, wait, my kid? Like, do you know our last name? Like, it's not just, like, that's normal and typical development. Okay, finally, teenagers and risky behavior. So, one of the things that I'm fascinated by is teenagers gossiping to their parents about what's happening at school. That it's a very common scenario, and if you guys have older adolescents, some of you may already be into this. If you don't have adolescents, great, let's get this right on the first pass. It's very common when teenagers come across behavior that scares them in their peers, for them to bring home that behavior and talk to their parents about it. Here's how they never do it. They never say, Dad, it turns out that that 10th grade boy, he's selling Adderall to the 9th graders. I'm worried about it. Okay, that is never how this comes up. The way it comes up is like, oh yeah, you know that kid, yeah, well he sells 9th graders Adderall. They put it out in this really neutral way. There's a reason they put it out in this neutral way. The reason they do it is that they're not sure what to make of it. Everybody else seems okay with it. They feel like it's kind of weird and there's something wrong, but they're not really sure, so they want to get your take on it, but they don't want to push you one way or the other. What's hard is that when your kid stands there and tells you another kid is selling amphetamines, and your kid seems to be like, it's okay, it's really hard not to have a strong and bad reaction to this. Be like, what? I'm calling the cops, this is terrible, right? It's okay if you've done this, but you can do better, right? Because then your kid's gonna be like, no, why did I tell you? I'm never telling you anything again, blah, 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 blah. It's also tempting if your kid's being cool with it to be like, oh, okay, that's cool, right? Because you're thinking, well, I do want you to keep telling me stuff, so I don't want to overreact. At which point your kid's like, okay, you think that's cool, really? Like, where are the laws? A really nice way to handle gossip when it comes, gossip or news of school or whatever, if it's something that's weird, all you have to say is, wow, really? That's enough. Because that alone, you're going to be like, yeah, right? That's all they need. And I will tell you, this happens in my practice a lot, where I will have teenagers who are observing behavior that feels wrong to them, but the context makes them unsure. A particular example, for a long time I saw the adolescent daughter of one of a very, very significant pediatrician in our community. And she offhandedly mentioned, and again, it's that offhanded mention that can really make it hard to know how to react. She offhandedly mentioned that with her parents both knowing, her boyfriend was sleeping over at her house and they were having sex in the house. Which, in the US, we don't do that, right? In other countries, that's part of the culture. It's not really what we do. So she offhandedly mentions this, and I'm like, your parents are okay with that? And she's like, I know! Right? But you have to kind of find that, like, I heard you, I'm not going to just take that at face value. That is enough, often, for teenagers to feel like they can get what they needed out of the interaction, or to say, well, what do you think about that, or something along those lines. So as you start to hear information, it'll probably surprise you, but be ready with the like, wow, really? Or what do you think? Or that sounds scary, or something like that, that gives the reality check, and then often becomes the opening for the kind of conversation you want to have. And I think that this is another thing I think about a lot. In theory, we want to have all these conversations about sex and drugs and drinking, and we feel like, how are we going to start those conversations? And we want to have those conversations. And then separately, kids are telling us in adolescence about sex and drugs and drinking that's happening in their class, or asking us about our own drug and drinking history and things like that. And these conversations were like, shut it down, right? And so I would say, like, these are actually the openings we're looking for. We just have to recognize that. Okay, so having actually brought up this question of our own drug histories, why don't I address it? It is a very common thing for teenagers to be like, well, did you smoke pot? Right? Okay, and statistically, you did. National statistics. So in Berkeley, you totally did. I would say, again, this is a big, fat opening to have the kind of conversation you want to be having. Come prepared with an answer. Your answer, I'm going to give you several options to get you started. So one is, and this one you just always should have on hand, That is a really good question. You deserve a really good answer. I'm coming back to you, right? And then you go think, right? Another is, I did. Here's my experience with it. Here's my worries for you. Here's my recommendation. You get to do your values. Another is, I didn't. I'm really glad I didn't. Here's why I'm glad I didn't. Another is, and a lot of you may start here, I want to give you an honest answer. I do not want you to take what I say as permission, so I'm kind of stuck. Right, or something like that. You can kind of do a half step. There's other answers in there. Your family, your culture of your family will dictate how you answer it. I can tell you what you cannot say. You cannot say, that's none of your business. Mm-hmm. Right? Because the teen translator is, you're a big fat hypocrite and you're telling me to do things that are different from what you yourself did. So that is not a viable answer. So have some answer, take it as a moment, but it is a moment. It is a big fat opening and you should be ready when it comes. Or at least ready with the I'm coming back to you. Okay. With regard to safety and risky behavior, I think a really important thing to bear in mind as your teenagers move into this zone is they will try to pull you into a dynamic where you're like a linebacker. And in this dynamic, they're the football player who's trying to get to all that super fun stuff over there. The parties, that one kid's crazy house, right? Whatever, sex, all that fun stuff, right? And you are the linebacker who's trying to keep them from getting there. Teenagers will set up this construction. They'll be like, why can't I go to Billy's house? Why won't you let me do that? And they're kind of like frustrating linebacker that is blocking all the fun stuff. And in this construction, the teenager has only one thing that they're going to try to do, which is, how do I get around the linebacker, right? So when your teenager says, why can't I smoke pot? A linebacker answer is, because it's illegal, right? Which is a very complex answer for teenagers these days anyway. And then they're thinking, okay, yeah, linebacker, you're keeping me from all that fun stuff out there. Instead of being a linebacker, you are all about safety, right? As we move into later adolescence, our rules, they are all basically safety rules. That's why we have rules, to keep kids safe. So, I'm not saying you should do this, but if you did do this, I want you to tell me and send me a picture. I think every family should have a neon sign that reads safety, and it hangs in their kitchen, and it has a nearby switch, right? So when your kid says, why can't I go to Billy's house? You're like, safety. The issue is, regardless of whether or not you get caught, it's a safety issue. Why can't I drive the car in the rain, in the middle of the night, on a dark night? And it will be brought to you exactly why linebacker of all fun hating linebacker you, why can't I do this, right? And instead of being because I said so, linebackery, you go, oh, safety, right? If the way you're going to get killed as a teenager, that is the number one option, right? So we're not doing that because that is really scary and not safe, right? So everything that you have around risk and self-management, put it under the umbrella of safety. Not under the umbrella of rules, not under the umbrella of laws. I will sometimes say to the privileged and largely white and protected teenage girls at the school where I consult, guys, by the time you're in the back of a cruiser, you're probably safe. You getting picked up by the cops is really the least of my concerns. What I'm concerned about is all the stuff that can happen that no grown-up could catch you at where you could get really hurt. So always, right, it's not the laws, it's not your rules. Those are there just because safety is the only thing that matters in adolescence. Or if we don't have that, we've got nothing. And the beautiful thing about doing this is that goes with them everywhere they go, right? We can't follow teenagers. We can't be there all the time. But if you instill this idea that it really comes down to safety, if you have a kid who can keep him or herself safe, they can do what they want. Right? That's the idea, right? That once they are managing that, they are free. And that's what they want. They want to be independent and autonomous. Okay, so when to worry. When a teen calculates risks in terms of the likelihood of getting caught, right? So you can have two kinds of teens. Teens who are should I do this? Who's going to catch me? Or should I do this? Could I get hurt? Right? So I think that's how you want to assess how much room to give your teenager. We really do have teenagers who at 14 are here's the problem with Billy's house. It always gets out of control. I don't want to go even if my parents don't know that that's where I am. That's a safe teenager. then you also have kids who are like, okay, you guys going out of town? Okay, when do you come back? Okay, cool, right? You know, like, that's not a safe teenager, right? I mean, that's the kind of distinction you need to make. I have to say, just for academic integrity, the conversations teenagers have with their parents about decision making and the decisions teenagers make when they're in groups of each other are two very different things. In the cold light of your kitchen, your kid can run down all the risks very readily. They get with their friends, they do all the things they just told you they know are dumb. So that, I think, should also be part of the conversation. We are sitting here, you and I both know pot's gonna pretty much not be very good for your brain right now, but let's be realistic, you're gonna go over to Billy's house, someone's gonna bring that along, how are you gonna handle that, right? You probably need to have that conversation too. Those are two different dynamics, you and your child alone, your child with other peers. So I'm gonna wrap up. I'd be happy to take questions. Thank you so much for having me.